Welcome back to Startups for the Rest of Us. I'm Rob Walling. If you read the title of today's episode and thought that I was getting a little clickbaity, I wasn't. Today is literally the story of a developer who got a job at a company. He became CTO over the course of 6 months, and then he bought the company for $1, and later he sold it in 2019. Stick around to hear how he managed to pull that off. It's a great conversation with Don Pottinger. And the day after this episode airs, I'll be hosting MicroConf Local in Portland, Oregon. If you're in the area, I'd love to see you there. And then next week, we're in Boston, then Austin, Texas, and the week after in Dubrovnik, Croatia. If you're coming to any of these events, please do come up and say hi. I'd love to meet you. And if you don't have tickets yet, I believe there's still a few remaining. You can head to microconf.com and click on our events section to figure out how to buy tickets. Again, the MicroConf Locals are one-day events, and they're quite inexpensive, so it makes the events really accessible. If you're in the area, I hope to see you there. And with that, let's dive into my conversation. Don Pottinger, thanks so much for joining me on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Rob. It's a great honor.
You have such a story. Oh my gosh. Started as a developer, and then you was a director of engineering, and then the CTO within 6 months. This was a company you came to work for as an employee. And then you later bought the company for $1, and then you grew it and exited a few years later. I don't think I've ever heard a story like this. So it's going to be fun. Can you give listeners a little bit of background about, how you came to work at Kevy and, maybe what attracted you to that, and just get us started on the story because it kind of tells itself from there.
Yeah. So before I joined Kevy, I was an aspiring developer and aspiring entrepreneur. I had started a company with my younger brother, and we both used that as a catalyst for us to learn how to code. He delved into mobile, and I went headfirst into web, learning Ruby, Rails, JavaScript. And at a certain point, we realized that our growth was stunted because we were self-taught. And I ended up joining a company called Big Nerd Ranch, who built apps for clients, both big and small. So I was able to learn on the job of how to build products. I spent about a couple years there, and I learned a lot through the process. And then I felt like I was ready to make the leap into the startup world, but I wasn't quite sure how to do it. And I wanted to learn from who I considered one of the best in Atlanta at the time. And so I interviewed and joined Kevy, which was founded by one of the co-founders of Pardot, which was a marketing automation platform that they sold for close to $100 million. And when I joined Kevy, my idea was to learn, to code, and then eventually, hopefully, start a company under that same kind of portfolio of companies that Kevy was under. But it went completely differently from what I expected.
Yeah, it's a good story too. I want to touch on one point that you just made, which was you were self-taught, you wanted to get better, so you got a day job coding 40 hours plus a week. I did the exact same thing. I learned to code as a kid on my Apple IIe, right? Basic. I mean, there was no web at the time. I'm that old. But I graduated from college with like a computer engineering degree, electrical engineering, and still didn't know how to code for the web. It was like the late 90s, and they weren't teaching that because the academy tends to be, depending on the school, 5, 10, 15 years behind actual industry. So I graduated and I was an electrician, I was working construction, and I would go to the library and check out books on Perl and PHP and HTML because I was like, the web is the future. .com is happening. I lived in the Bay Area. And I was trying to teach myself. I was doing it nights and weekends, and I just was not making progress. And the moment that changed was when I finally applied for a full-time job. And it was the same thing. I worked for an agency, and we were building, websites and web apps. And in the first 2 months, I learned more than I had learned in a year of self-study.
Yeah, for me, that was a very similar experience. So I went to Georgia Tech. I studied electrical and computer engineering there. My favorite classes were the programming classes, but it was C, C++.
Java, if you're lucky.
Yeah, Java. There weren't things that were, at the time, you could easily take and build for the web. And so I initially started with PHP on my own, basically taking what little code I could find on the internet and basically doing a hatchet job on it to make it do what I wanted it to do. But it wasn't until I came across Rails and Michael Hartle's Ruby on Rails course, which I'm sure many people have taken, where I built a Twitter clone. And I had no idea what I was doing at the time, but I learned a lot just by typing in the commands. And, eventually when I started building my own things, going back to that tutorial and seeing how they recommended to do certain things. And of course, Rails cast during that period as well was big. And so that really helped me get in the door at my job, right? Because I joined a company that was a Ruby boutique firm. And so they were looking for junior developers with an idea, like they really wanted to learn. And I was able to surround myself with very talented and senior engineers that taught me how to take what I'd been doing on nights and weekends and turn it into, I considered myself a crafts person at the time. Yeah.
And that's a great part of the story, I think, is that just what the web has done for learning technical skills. Because again, I graduated in 1998 from college, and there was one website that had tutorials on how to program. Like you just couldn't find them, And so when I say I went to the library, no, I literally drove my car, got a dead tree book, And it's so cool that you had podcasts and video casts and tutorial, just you can learn incredible amounts. I think it's done the wonders for development and entrepreneurship.
And if you're lucky, you have a mentor. And so I was lucky that I had a mentor that had been building a company, and he told me, hey, stop what you're doing, go learn Ruby on Rails, and see where that takes you from there. And to this day, I credit that person for starting me on a journey that I never would have imagined, over 10 years ago now.
And so you apply and you get a job at Kevi in December of 2014. And at the time, Kevi was competing with Zapier. Is that right?
This was early days. So Zapier and Kevi were competitors in what I would consider that sending data from point A to point B. I think where Kevi was focused is that they had a lot of e-commerce companies that were trying to send data from their e-commerce platform to a CRM or to their marketing automation platform. And at the time, they were getting customers, but they were also losing customers. So they were really concerned about the churn. And I think, after I joined in late 2014, they decided in early 2015 that they wanted to pivot.
Got it. And how big was the team?
The team grew to about, I would say, 20 or 25 at that time. Yeah. When I joined, yeah, it was about that big. And we hired several salespeople after me.
And so the kind of the Zapier approach isn't working because churn's too high. And so talk me through the pivot. I know that was early 2015. Is the pivot what led to you going from software engineer to director of engineering to CTO within 6 months?
I guess if there's one thing about startups is that things change very quickly. And in this case, the pivot led to the departure of the most senior engineer at Kevi. And so, there were a few other engineers. I was one of them. And at the time, I felt very confident that I could build a greenfield project. I could take something and start from scratch, design it and build it. And so with that opportunity of the pivot where we had to build an entirely new platform, and in this case, we were focused on the e-commerce companies that were our customers, building a platform that allowed them to market directly to their customers in one place. I felt confident that I could do that. And so with that, I became the director of engineering. And I was doing that for a few months before there was a leadership shakeup, and I became the CTO about a few months after that.
And how did that feel as someone who, you'd been coding for a couple years at that time professionally? Like that feels like a big responsibility to be CTO at a startup at that early.
Yeah, it was. And I had made a pivot myself into software development. Coming out of college, I was a consultant. I worked at Accenture and another mid-sized consulting firm for a few years. So development wasn't the first thing I did. I was comfortable talking to teammates, potential customers. Like I felt like I could do sales. So I felt like I was at a point where I had been building up my skills to be multifaceted in a way that really benefits you as an entrepreneur. So yeah, it felt really quick. It felt really fast, but I also felt like this is exactly why I joined Kevi in the first place, and was to get an opportunity to lead a company. And was I ready? Yes and no. I learned a lot through the process. It's not great when you have to let go of teammates, right? Or when you're trying to sell or you're losing new customers and going through all those pain and trying to raise money. But it really was an experience that I wouldn't trade for anything in the world.
And that's the beauty and the curse of startups is that things change so quickly, and there's that upward mobility or just the mobility within an org that can happen. Obviously, those circumstances where it was not good, sometimes it's layoffs or whatever, but if you go work for a Fortune 1000 company, the odds of you moving from a software engineer to a director to, at some C-level, it's never going to happen. I understand that, it's different to be a C-level at Target or Best Buy than it is at Kevy when it shrinks down. So there is a difference. I'm not trying to equate them, but I do recall also working at a small consulting firm, then a small startup myself, and feeling like I was given all these amazing tasks instead of being a little cog, in a wheel, that I was actually given a lot more responsibility to just go do it because there were 5 of us or whatever. So then with Kevy, with the pivot, the product pivot, was there also a round of layoffs? Like, did it go from 2025 down, or did you keep everybody, all the employees?
So we had 2 rounds of layoffs, unfortunately. So once we pivoted, we realized we didn't need a large sales team because there was no product to sell. So we kept a very small sales team, and we, were building very quickly, trying to get something that the remaining sales team could put in front of customers, demo, and get feedback and hopefully sign some deals. But it came to the point where we realized we still needed a little bit more time. And probably the best sales people for our product was going to be us, me as the CTO and my co-founder, the CEO as well. So once we had to make that tough decision, that, was really hard to let go of teammates and people that you'd really grown close to. So that was a really hard lesson that not everything is rosy in a startup.
Was that one of the hardest pieces for you? Was the kind of the interpersonal, just having to let people go who you knew were doing a good job, but it was just kind of, crazy.
Yeah, that was a really hard part. And then I'm grateful that I've maintained relationships with the vast majority of them after that experience. And also the interpersonal relationships of the people that stayed. No one really talks about how challenging that can be sometimes. Like, there can be friction sometimes between engineering and sales, where sales is wondering, can we sell something like this? And engineering is like, wait a minute, we haven't built that yet. Or, it's going to take time to build that. So that friction existed. Also, trying to keep the people that you did have from looking at other opportunities, because, in a startup, it's hard to see the forest from the trees when you're heads down working. And so, there can be turnover, there can be we were working in a startup kind of incubation space. There are other startups that are vying for really good talent as well. And it's always easy to look, and say, oh, it might be better over there at that other company that seems to be growing very quickly.
Yeah, when layoffs happen, that always, recruiters start targeting companies, for the people who are remaining. It's pretty common practice. So it sounds like that was brutal. You go through, it wasn't even a pivot. You literally threw out the code base and you started essentially from scratch and built a different product, which is, I think you already said it, but a marketing automation platform focused on e-commerce. So you and I are both pretty familiar with that. For folks who haven't followed my story for a long time, I built Drip, which started as an email service provider, eventually became marketing automation provider, like a lightweight marketing automation. And then it was more focused on, when I was running it, it was general purpose, really. It was SaaS and bloggers and people with email lists. We pulled a lot of people from MailChimp and Infusionsoft, and then sold the company in 2016 to Leadpages. And then it wasn't even a pivot. It was a focused on e-commerce companies as well. And so now competing with the likes of Klaviyo and MailChimp, as you said, MailChimp has really done just a slight focus on that. You mentioned offline that the founder moved essentially to a role as an investor advisor, and then a new CEO came in. Did it happen at this point as well, the pivot? So it was a massive shakeup. It's like a new company with just a handful of people. You were down to 5 employees.
Yeah, it was.
Right?
The new CEO was someone at the company that had been promoted into the CEO role. So she was a young CEO. I was a young CTO. So we were both learning on the fly. And although, I would say we're very ambitious, had delusions of grandeur in some respects. And, we were heads down. We were both working hard because we thought at the time, this is it. This is our opportunity. And we don't want to let our team down. We don't want to let our investor down. And so we were working nonstop. At that point, I was working, I can't even remember how many hours, but anytime I was in front of a computer, I was probably coding. And I have a family. I have one child at that point. I had two more on the way, twin girls on the way at the time. So it was a very busy period.
And I assume that MRR went to zero, right? Or approximately. And so that you must have had enough funding in the bank to float you guys for a year or more. Because I think you said you spent the next 18 months building the product, finding customers, growing MRR.
I think we got it, if I remember clearly, we got a check of about $300,000 from the investor. That's kind of like, honestly, if you think about it, it should have been reincorporated as a new company. The cap table should have been cleared, which we can talk about the cap table later. But it was essentially a new company with the same name.
Yeah, let's talk about the cap table, because this winds up screwing you guys, because you start making progress. You spend the next 18 months, you get to 250,000 ARR. So you build this thing back up to 20 grand a month, and you want to go raise funding, and you can't.
Yeah, we would walk into investor meetings, and they would be very interested in what we were doing, the space, and we get to due diligence, and they take a look at the cap table and see that the original founder, along with several other people that were brought on to the company and that had left, had big chunks of the company, while the CEO and CTO, me, had a very small amount of the company. And that raised a lot of questions. That caused a lot of trepidation with investors, especially where we were in Atlanta. They were less inclined to take a chance on a very messy cap table. And so, we would go in and feel very optimistic. And a couple weeks later, there were crickets, or it was a no because of the complexities with our cap table, not necessarily what our product was able to do, not the customers that in the revenue that we've hit. So that was very challenging and also disheartening, because it had gotten to the point where we're not sure what to do. Do we go back to our original investor and ask for more funds and get further diluted, or what? And that led to another big shakeup in the company and around the fall of 2016.
And before we get to that, I want to call out, we have had multiple companies apply to Tiny Seed. We get in conversations with them, and we make them an offer, or we want to make them an offer, but we discover that the founder or founders owns a minority share of their own company. And usually it's, in the cases we've seen, it's they started the company and there was an investor there who put in a small amount of money. Usually it's sad. It's 25 grand or 50 grand and takes 50, 60, it just takes way too much of the company. And when there's nothing there, you can see how that makes logical sense, but it keeps you from ever raising money again. You can never raise money because investors don't want someone sitting there with the lion's share of the equity. They want the people doing the work to have that. So this is not to say never raise investment. It's to say be careful about your cap table. The founders in an early stage company like this, raising a first or second round, pre-seed, an accelerator round, a seed round, the founders should own 80, 90% of the company, between them, if it's 1 or 3 or 5, whatever. They should own that together. So it's something to keep in mind for folks, because I think especially listeners of this podcast, if you're a bootstrapper, you've never had to think about cap tables because you just always had 100% of it. And the moment that, if you do think about raising a small round, be really aware that my rule of thumb, and I think the general rule of thumb is, in an investment round, you usually sell between 10 and 20% of your company, depending on the amount you decide on evaluation. And then you take, 10% of that, or again, 20. It's pretty rare I hear someone selling, unless they're selling their own shares in a secondary. It's rare someone sells more than 20. I see you smiling. Do you have, more stories?
The experience that I went through, with Kevy really left a bad taste in my mouth for raising money. And I went firmly into, I am going to fully bootstrap everything I do for the rest of my life for a period of time. Only now, the past couple of years, to come out of that and feel like it depends. It really depends on who you are, what your goals are. In my case, with Kevy, I didn't really stand a chance because I owned so little of the company at the time. So I just know that being careful and understanding who you're bringing on as an investor is equally as important as if you decide not to and you want to just continually have a sustainable business as a bootstrapper.
And so you mentioned there was a shakeup in 2016 because you weren't able to raise funds.
So
what happened there?
My CEO just left. But to be honest, she had been talking about it for a little while. So it wasn't a surprise for me, but it was a surprise to our investor. I think it shocked him to the core because he felt like we were on a positive track. He didn't see that there were any issues outside of continuing to figure out what product market fit and being heads down on selling and also raising money. However, with the departure of the CEO, it left him in a kind of a crisis in terms of what to do with the company. That company had been his baby post his acquisition. But I think at that point he was ready to close up shop, let go of the entire team. Before he did that, he asked me what I wanted to do with the company. Did I want to take over the reins? And I had to give it some thought. But I think I realized that I would be in a similar situation to the CEO who just left. And so I proposed something completely different. I proposed that I would buy the company, the assets from him if he was going to shut it down or if he didn't want to find a new CEO. And he gave it some thought and he agreed to sell it to me for basically nothing, $1, which was just kind of crazy.
Yeah. Did this happen in real time? Like, were you sitting in a room looking at each other with this conversation, or was it like a back and forth via email?
It was in real time. So you can imagine like a scene out of a movie. If it was dramatized, that's how it felt in my mind. We were sitting across from each other and I was really trying to fight for the life of the company. I said, please don't shut it down. You can find a new CEO. He wasn't convinced. So I was like, well, I want to continue working on it. But I think I phrased it in a way that, looking back now, I don't know if it came off the right way. I want to do it without you. And he did some kind of back of the napkin calculation in his mind in terms of the company's growth, what were the expenses, trying to, I guess, decide what a good asking price would be for the company. But I think he just came to the conclusion that, hey, this is really nothing to me, more than, a line item in his portfolio. And for me, it would be kind of life-changing. And so it all happened in one conversation. And then after that, we got the paperwork and I took $1, put it in an envelope and walked over to his desk one day and dropped it off just to make sure that he did receive the $1 for the company.
The I's were dotted. It's like a scene out of an Aaron Sorkin film, man. He couldn't write it better. That's crazy. Well, here's the other thing too. As an investor, he invested in a lot of companies. Okay. So he also probably for sure has capital gains that he could then write that off. So he could get at least 30 to 40% of it back from the IRS. So I'm not saying that's a good or a bad motivation, but that is why you'll hear some VCs write off. Like if you're familiar with Barometrics, like Stripe Capital or Stripe, whatever the venture arm they had, they just wrote that investment off, to nothing. And they're able to then, they don't get it all back, but you basically don't pay the taxes on equivalent gains, right? It's like having a loss in the stock market and a gain that offsets it. So that makes sense that he got something out of it. And I imagine if he's trying to think, he's like, what am I going to sell you this? How much am I going to sell this company to you for? And are you going to take out a loan to buy it? I don't know that you were in a cash position to be able to pay whatever, 50 grand or 100 grand.
I was not. I was looking for jobs at that point. So it was something that I had pretty much decided I was willing to walk away from. But when the opportunity came, I decided to take it, and it changed the course of my career.
Absolutely. The course of your life. Well, what a gutsy move to say, I want to do this, but without you. Like that must have, was that scary? Are you the kind of person? So that scares me because I'm not super confrontational, and that feels like a very confrontational
I'm not confrontational at all. I work very well with others because there's usually not anything for me to fight about. And so in this case, I think I felt strongly enough about the company and more so confident in my own abilities because I built it. Like almost every line of code that was there was written by me or reviewed by me or touched by me. And I'd been in plenty of the sales conversations. I knew how to support the customers. And because of the revenue that I felt comfortable. It felt like the most comfortable risk I could take at that point because I dreamed of running my own company myself. And I de-risked a lot of that for the past 18 months by building it and having someone fund that kind of discovery, it felt almost like a no-brainer to at least give it a shot.
Yeah, and it was your company in essence. It was as if you and your CEO, I think you were calling her your co-founder, but like the CEO, you guys had started a new company that should have had a new cap table, to the point you made earlier. I can imagine you had massive ownership over this, mental ownership of it, of just like, yeah, this is the thing, and I can grow it. Like I hate when people use the word "it's my baby," but it's pretty, like you had spent a lot of time.
Yeah, and you can imagine too, when you go from being an employee to on paper being CEO and getting an agreement that says, hey, you have X amount of shares, and trying to do the math on what percentage of the company that is, and then realizing that it's 5%. And you're like, well, I'm putting all of my blood, sweat, and tears for something that I own 5% of. And using terminology like I'm a co-founder was very difficult for me. I had to have people support me and say, yes, you are a co-founder. A lot of people don't understand, especially when you're young and you're being employed, the courage and the agency it takes to be able to say, yes, you may have funded this company, but I'm building it. So I deserve to be a co-founder. I deserve to own a large enough share of the company. And it took me a long time to realize that. And I kind of grew into that as after the acquisition, realizing that, hey, this is my company too.
Yeah. And so at this point, you own 100% of it, but you don't, I imagine, you had revenue at this point, but were you break even? Did you need to raise money? Because it sounds like, you told me offline that you started doing everything yourself: sales, marketing, support, development. Did you have any other team members? Or
at this point, I was solo. Yeah. My initial idea was that I was going to just continue growing the company like we were growing previously. And I ran into a wall. I ran into, keeping customers is difficult. Acquiring new customers is difficult when you're all by yourself, and developing the product simultaneously, all at the same time, was very difficult. So I tried to continue working very hard for the first 6 months after the acquisition. And then I hit a wall where I felt burnt out, and I had to take a step back and really evaluate, why am I doing this? I have 100% of this company. Am I trying to make it the next billion-dollar company? If that's the case, I can't do it by myself. Or am I trying to have a high quality of life? Am I trying to be able to spend as much time as I can with my family, work from anywhere, have the ultimate flexibility? Because the revenue was more than enough for a solo founder, and the expenses were low enough that, I was riding on different credits from cloud providers. So I was able to keep expenses pretty low.
Yeah. And so you have this amazing lifestyle business, this kind of bootstrapper's dream at this point, except for you burn out. That was a problem, right? So when you took that step back, I know you mentioned that you've been a longtime listener of Startups for the Rest of Us. And I want to take a moment to talk about like virtual mentorship, because you said that Mike and I chatting together and me talking about burnout and drip or whatever it was I was talking about somehow, helped you on your journey.
Yeah, Rob, it was cathartic. After spending the entire day working on Kevy, I would fire up the podcast and listen to you and Mike, and Mike's journey with Blue Tick. It felt like I was in therapy with Mike and you, and your journey with Drip and post-acquisition. And I was just listening to every single detail, listening to the intonation in your voice, trying to read what you couldn't say sometimes from that. And it was inspiring. It was also felt like I wasn't alone, which, as a solo founder, if you're not really into communities, online communities, it can be challenging. Luckily, I had a support system that was local, and then also podcasts that I would listen to, like Startups for the Rest of Us, and that really helped carry me through.
And that's great to hear. You've heard me say it, that like we've done the podcast for almost 12 years now for free, and that's one of the big reasons we do it, is because we wanted to find others like us, and we just want to be able to. It's not even give back. It's just help other people. The amount of good I think that is put into the world is substantial. And it's so good to hear, because you and I, before today, have never met. We haven't even barely emailed, just to schedule this. So, and yet I was able to have that impact on you. And I hope that those who are listening, like we can do that in our own ways, So it's awesome, man. It's great to hear. So let's go back to the story. So now you own the company, you burn out, but then you recover. Where do you go from here? Because in 2019 then, which was a couple years later, 2 or 3 years later, you wind up selling the company. So what's the summary of that in between? Was it more of the same, but were you lifestyling? Did you start hiring people? When you sold, were you solo? What are the details there?
Yeah, it's a mix of, I was lifestyling almost to a fault in some ways. I think things had grown stagnant. I gravitated toward what was interesting for me to work on, like product. I loved building. And I would let things like marketing, yeah, I'll get to that eventually. And I would do sales when inbound sales would come in. I would do demos, I would follow up, close the deals, things like that. And I brought on different people at different points. So I brought on a salesperson that was, working on doing demos, cold outreach, things like that. It didn't really work out that well. And then around the tail end, probably about a year before I sold the company, a friend of mine who's a data scientist, he was working on a startup. He said, well, you're a data scientist. I'm sitting on a lot of data right now with Kevi, e-commerce behavioral data. Maybe we can build something of value for our customers, for the Kevi customers, using your, artificial intelligence, machine learning knowledge. And so we started collaborating and we started building new, exciting, what we called smart features for Kevi. Things like being able to tell you how effective your email will be based on the subject line. And eventually the plan was we would give you the ability to write your entire email without having to do it yourself based on your previous emails, based on emails that have been effective in the past. And so we were building and building and building that. And then I think in December of 2018, my wife shared that she's pregnant and it's our fourth child. And up until that point, my wife had been working enough she's a nurse practitioner. She'd be working enough to provide health insurance for us so that we didn't have to worry about at least that part with me being an entrepreneur. And you got to the point where she's like, well, I think we need to make a change because I don't want to work full time anymore. And I said, okay, well, I can at least put out some feelers and see, what's out there. And a friend from Google reached out to me and I ended up getting, a job at Google and running Kevi at the same time. And so that was in April of 2019. So there was a period of time where I decided I wanted to sell Kevi, but I was working out at Google. And so I got a broker and I was talking to potential acquirers. Some were serious about acquiring, but they wanted me to join as well. And I had to share with them that I wasn't on the table as part of the acquisition. And then eventually I found a venture studio that had a similar SaaS product in the similar space. And they were really interested in acquiring. They had the technical chops to be able to take over the project. They had aspirations for their sales and marketing as well. And after due diligence, I ended up closing the deal. So I literally signed the papers to sell Kevi in the hospital after my wife gave birth. So it was kind of a crazy period there.
Sounds insane, man. I was going to say good timing, but probably terrible timing because I imagine that was stressful coming up. And so, the question that I usually ask here is there's life-changing money, which to some people, oftentimes that's a few $100,000, and then there's never have to work again money, sunset money, right? Which is usually for most people, depending on where you live, it's several $1,000,000, right? And there's in-betweens, whatever. But how would you describe your exit?
It was life-changing. It's not never have to work again. But I think for me, letting go was hard because, like we said, it was my baby. I would work on it for the next several years and it may not go anywhere. It may not grow. And in some respects, the competition at the time, like Klaviyo and MailChimp and other companies had exploded in growth. They had deep pockets. They've been working extremely hard on developing and improving their product. And I didn't have that in me as a solo founder. It was very difficult. So it was great timing. And it was also a life-changing amount of money that I earned by signing a piece of paper. So it was a life-changing experience to own and run Kevi. But I think it was great to close that chapter so that I can begin a new chapter with new projects and new endeavors.
And with a new a new child who is a new project. 4 kids, that's another level, man. It's another level. And so you're a glutton for punishment like most of us. I mean, as we move towards wrapping up, I am intrigued because you've launched another, I'll just say a startup, and it's essentially, it's a B2B play. I'm sorry, it's a B2C play. It's called Languatalk at languatalk.com. And you mentioned to me before we hit record that it grew very quickly. You launched in January, so you're maybe 8 or 9 months ago, and you're already at mid 6-figure ARR with it. What's the difference there?
There's so many differences. One, I have a committed co-founder who has grown and built a company in this space before. So during some of my lonely periods, I would roam indie hackers and look at posts, and my co-founder, before he was my co-founder, had a post of, hey, I have a business. It pretty much runs itself. So if any other indie hackers want some help on some marketing, just reach out. And I was like, all right, sure, I'll reach out. So I reached out, and he did some work for Kevy, and we stayed connected for the next couple of years. And after I sold Kevy and I was kind of bored at the day job, just kind of dreaming about what to build next, we reconnected, and I said, that platform that you've built, you're a great marketer. You know this space very well, but I think I could help you build something that we could grow to even higher heights. And he thought about it. He's like, are you serious? Shouldn't you be comfortable and like done? And do you have the capacity and the time to do this? And I was like, no, I don't, but I'll do it. Let's do it. And we started building last year. And it took me longer than I expected. I didn't expect my building skills to atrophy as much. But we launched in January. And because my co-founder had been in the space before, he kind of knew all of the knobs, the marketing, the timing, the ads. And me from the technology side, we had everything buttoned up. And so it's been really amazing to go from literally $0 in revenue to mid 6 figures in ARR. So it's really exciting because it's very early days, and we've only launched probably about 5 languages, and we're planning on launching several more in the coming weeks.
Good for you guys. You don't know if it's being a second-time entrepreneur, because that's got to have something to do with it. All the years of struggle. It's like the Beatles in the Cavern Club for 4 years playing, 10-hour sets and stuff. It's like, no wonder they got good. It's like you went through a gauntlet, and you came out the other side and you sold your company. And I do it a second time. Like, I do find that I can get what used to be a day's work for me, 8 hours a day. I can often get that done in 1 or 2 now. I'm more efficient. I'm more effective. I'm better at delegating. I'm just more everything. And I feel like that happens with a lot of us, smart folks like yourself who are learning.
It does. And I know when to walk away. I think when I was early on in my career, I would sit there in front of the computer, banging my head across, like, why can't I fix this bug, or why can't I solve this problem? And now I know that if I walk away, I go to sleep, you can solve things with a fresher mind, or you solve things in your sleep as well. So you learn through the pain, and that muscle memory is still there if you decide to go back to it. And also, I think going with the tide is important, right? Building a platform that helps people learn languages over tools like Zoom in the midst of a pandemic. I think, that timing is important as well. So you have to do the work, but I think you also have to pick the right space and also have the right timing too.
I'm quickly Googling your Twitter handle because I always say or is there a particular thing, you have a website or Twitter that you'd like me to plug?
Of course, if you're interested in learning a language, languatalk.com. My Twitter is Don Pottinger, first name and last name.
Awesome, sir. Thanks so much for coming on the show. Thanks again to Don for coming on the show, and thank you for being a loyal listener and coming back every week. If you're not already subscribed, please do hit that subscribe button. And if you haven't checked out the MicroConf YouTube channel, that's something we continue to invest in. And we just hit 9,000 subscribers, I think 300,000 views since we launched it just over a year ago. It's pretty popular. YouTube.com/microconf. And like every week, I'll be back in your earbuds again next Tuesday morning.